So I'm going to get going. I'm Mark Hanuel. I'm Director of the Institute for the Humanities at UIC, and I'd like to welcome you to this Faculty Fellows lecture featuring Professor Anna Kornbluh. I have just a few announcements to make about upcoming events at the Institute. On February 17th, we have a Digital Humanities workshop, and this is co-sponsored with the library, with the UIC library. It's on February 17th, it's 9 to 1, and you can register for that workshop. It's a range of digital tools, and you can register for the workshop by going to the Digital Humanities Initiative website. There are also a range of other workshops that are also DHI sponsored workshops. These are on particular digital tools, and these are at the library. And I've heard that those spots are filling up fast for all of these. So if you are interested, please go register for those soon. Next up will be Beate Geisler, who will be giving her fellows lecture on March 10th. Coming up further down the line, Gayatri Spivak will be joining us on April 14th and 15th on Zoom for our visiting fellow events. You know, it's much to our dismay that we're still doing these Zoom events, and we've delayed Professor Spivak's visit, and we finally, over the phone, just said, let's do it on Zoom. So that's what we're doing, and she's very excited about it, and so am I. So you can register for those on our website as well. For other events that are coming up, follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and of course, check out our calendar. And we're incredibly grateful for all of you who are here for this lecture and for who are our audience at our other Institute events. We don't take it for granted during these times. It's so important to keep our conversations going, keep humanities debates alive. And so we're very grateful to our working group leaders and other contributors to our Institute life, and certainly to our audiences. Last but not least, thank you to Linda Vavra, to Dan Majors and Tierney Powell, who keep all of this running during these crazy times. So it's my great pleasure. I should say just a little comment about our logistics. After our talk, we'll have a question and answer session, and you can either post in the chat. You can post a question in the chat and we'll pick up on it and we'll get you to speak if you're willing. You can also use that hand raise function, and we'll use a combination of these. And if it's okay with you, Anna, I can help you negotiate those different questions, because they can sometimes come in thick and fast. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Anna Kornbluh, Professor of English at UIC. Professor Kornbluh and I have a distinctive relationship that I don't usually comment on, because in most circumstances it's irrelevant. But I was actually on the committee that hired Professor Kornbluh when she came to UIC in 2007. She has been at UIC since 2007, and although I don't have a lot of great administrative accomplishments, especially in the English department, having Anna come to the English department and join us at UIC, I consider that to be like a really, really great thing. And we've been so grateful to her work, both in the English department and at UIC as a whole. So Professor Kornbluh's work centers on the 19th century novel and formal negotiations with politics and economics, and she's done much to encourage us to take stock of the novel as the preeminent genre for political and institutional thinking. She also has other interests in critical theory and film, engaging her serious interests in the powers of literary and political forms to address literature, culture, and institutional thinking on many different levels. This impressively broad but also sharply defined set of commitments is evident in her 3 books: Realizing Capital, Financial and Psychic Economies in Victorian Realist Form from 2014, Marxist Film Theory and Fight Club from 2019, and The Order of Forms, Realism, Formalism, and Social Space, published in 2019. In over 40 articles and reviews and numerous talks at venues across the US and Europe, she has written and spoken on these subjects and related topics like the future of literary theory, the concept of literary form, the use of literary studies, and quite recently, the Academy's response to the coronavirus epidemic, many of these matters of urgency to wide audiences. Anyone who observes Professor Kornbluh's work here at UIC and far beyond also knows how important she has been as a builder of community in literary studies. Her V21 collective, a vigorous community of scholars and students of Victorian literature, has been a model for connecting and re-energizing scholarship in many disciplines that have now formed similar collectives. The ultimate convener in settings both formal and informal, Kornbluh has lovingly organized or co-organized conferences and panels at UIC and elsewhere, including one very successful event on political futures right here at the Institute just a couple of years ago, and this was co-organized with Nasser Mufti. We're grateful to have her now here in our community of scholars at the Institute to present her work, Immediacy on Style Lately. Please join me in welcoming Anna Kornbluh.
Thank you for that so much, Mark. Let's see, I am going to share screen. Is that all right? And are you seeing some screen now? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thanks to Mark for that kind introduction, and then to Linda and Tierney, and Dan, and to Tina, the captioner. And I also want to thank my research assistants and friends, Ritika Ramamurthy and Justin Radin. These are like such hard conditions that everyone is working in, trying to hold open a space for ideas. And I'm just truly grateful that you could all be here. It is best to start in the middle. Consider these two weirdly close moments from otherwise distant thinkers of our time. See this? Just the thought of fiction, just the thought of a fabricated character and a fabricated plot made me feel nauseous. I reacted in a physical way. Over recent years, I had increasingly lost faith in literature. I read and thought, this is something someone has made up people in a made up, though realistic world. It was a crisis. I couldn't write like this. It wouldn't work. Every sentence was met with the thought, but you're just making this up. It has no value. Fictional writing has no value. The only genres I saw value in, which still conferred meaning, were diaries and essays, the types of literature that did not deal with narrative, that were not about anything, but just consisted of a voice, the voice of your own personality. Art cannot be experienced collectively. Nothing can. Okay, so that's one. And then two. We critical theorists should no longer be speaking for others. The question, what is to be done, must be reformulated today. Critical theory cannot speak for others. It must instead foster a space for everyone who shares the critical ambition to speak and be heard. The solution to the problem of speaking for others is not to silence anyone, but the opposite, to collaborate and cultivate spaces where all can be heard, especially those who are most affected by our crises today. This reflects a new writing style and grammar today. We no longer write in the third person, as Horkheimer did at mid-century. We do not write in universal form either, as Marx or Hegel did before that. Neither do we hide behind the passive tense. No, today Each and every one of us must write in the first person. And that means we can no longer ask passively what is to be done, but must actively reformulate the very question of critical praxis for ourselves. For me, it becomes, what more shall I do? Existing modes of writing cannot work. Only a voice will do. Together, these two titans of 21st century letters distill a cultural dominant, a wariness of representation for which the salve is personalism. Here, a laureled professor and death penalty lawyer, that's Bernard Harcourt, and an inspirational creative writer with millions and millions of fans worldwide, that's Knausgaard, share the imperative that first-person accounting is more legitimate politically and aesthetically than other modes. Theory is no longer tenable. Fictional writing has no value. This retirement from the constructions of representation calls out the overreach beyond the personal toward made-up people in a made-up world, since nothing can be experienced collectively, since we cannot speak for others. Emptying out the speculative, synthetic, and collective dimensions of fiction and theory, filling that void with a genre-bending, fulminative real talk, the voice of your own personality. This magniloquent univocity pronounces our zeitgeist, the singular first-person pronoun, as epistemic life jacket and political prophylactic, an explicit repudiation of mediations that would seek the middle ground between one experience and another. It would be a mistake to assign the appeal of this position to white male melancholy, since deep traditions of feminist and Black epistemology and exploration underwrite both of these credos. Indeed, in the very next paragraph after we've read, Harcourt cites at length Angela Davis, Fred Moten, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Sarah Ahmed, Chantal Mouffe, and Knausgaard's works belong in a lineage of queer of color fictive autobiography, from James Baldwin to Ocean Vuong, and have been celebrated as feminist, or at least feminine, by Siri Hustvedt, Katie Roiphe, and many others. Metabolizing vibrant 20th century literature and theories, authentications of situated knowing, elevations of personal experience, and transpositions of politics into ethos. This 21st century first personalism encompasses theory tomes and literary volumes, university writing pedagogy, and the rise of academic autoethnography across the disciplines, but also the hashtag Own Voices movement and mantras of the Oprah industrial complex, like speak your truth, as well as an even broader architecture of personal branding, me politics, and I tech. The nausea at mediation belongs, in other words, to a bustling market of self-presentation, one which capaciously promotes manifestism as internal redress of its own depravities. The more dehumanizing our world becomes, the more gross the failures of human society, the more splintered the efforts at collective transformation, the more winning the project of care of the self. The now material irrefutability of catastrophic ecocide, the historical outmodedness of this irrational and immiserating zombie capitalism, the epidemic of depression and anxiety, declining life expectancy, domestic abuse, mass violence, mass incarceration, and the group differentiated vulnerability to all of these terrors, to slightly bend Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism. All these deformities impugn existing sociability and beget, it seems, atomistic absorption as its readiest alternative. To give a name to this resultant matrix of social suspicion, emergency, and self-surging. To mark this ubiquitous style, and to grasp, therefore, a little history of the present, let us try on immediacy. Immediacy is the estate of direct presence, the I without fiction or theory, an immersive ipseity as against relation, effusion without medium, expressivism in a pressure cooker. The prefix im connotes both prepositionality and inness or onness of continuity without anything in between. And it also connotes negation. No discontinuity, no distance, hashtag no filter. In the middle, without mediation. The rule of culture. Immediacy trumpets intensity and instantaneity in on-demand content, fast gratification apps, confessional streaming TV, cringe cinema, warp speed cycle news, literary anti-fictionality, critical realism, and the car selfie. That's that hottie in the middle there. Flow is its byword. Free-formless effulgence as aesthetic ideal, psychopolitical emancipation, and economic optimality. Immediacy can be studied across lots of media. If the idea works, examples should be popping in your head right now. But its specifically literary and intellectual actualization looks like the anti-fictional, anti-theoretical, anti-representational personalism Harcourt and Knausgaard openly declare. It looks like the intimacy of presence and present tense in their discourse. And it looks as well like the throbbing immanentism that results from all this compressive inversion. Having made the case for praxis as decentering, in which, quote, universality is replaced by particularity, what is true now turns on personal self-interests, and having made the case for praxis as a retreat from institutions to the personal, because, quote, organizations are obstacles to organizing ourselves. We need to turn inward to transform the self. Our death penalty lawyer and law professor then culminates his 700-page tome in sublime dispersal. Oops, sorry. Everything we do as individuals, this is still hardcore, every choice we make, every action we take affects these struggles and upheavals. This is the unbearable and daunting reality every one of our most minute actions will affect. Unbearable indeed, agonizing and excruciating, the burden is almost too much to bear. The utter singularity and endlessness of the struggle. It is urgent. Time is running out. So here, in this electric charge, immediacy as urgency, as inwardness, and as immersive infinitesimal tessellation. Everything is everything. And here as well, a reverberant rhyme with Knausgaard's acid brilliant flat ontology. The virtually endless and utterly homogeneous stream of stuff that Frederick Jameson calls itemization and Lisa Olson calls the celestial everyday. So this is Knausgaard. Everything had its own significance. The fabric of a pair of trousers was significant. The width of a trouser leg was significant. The pattern in the curtain hung in front of a window was significant. Everything became visible in its light. The bits of food on the floor, the trail of coffee stains that ran from the counter on the right to the sink on the other side, the globules of fat that specked the surface of the sausage water in the saucepan, the two bloated sausages. This list continues for 3 whole pages. The unbearable heaviness of being concords the author's practice with the law professor's praxis. The endlessness of the struggle is enacted in the volubility of my struggle, which runs 3,600 pages. Just as Harcourt resigns theory's abstractions in favor of immediate scrutiny of the most minute, Knausgaard concurs. There are a lot of brilliant analyses of our time, but they are by nature about the big picture, the general structures, and the long-term tendencies. What a novel can do is the opposite. It can go into the particular, into the concrete singular life. That's the only thing that really exists. Particulars, sausages, voices. That's the only thing that really exists. Obdurate concretudes, greasy crescents, shimmering singularities, and their successional liturgy. That's immediacy. The palpable overlap, then, between these two prominent but divergent texts exemplifies the writerly instantiations of immediacy as the style of our times, an indiscriminate immersion, items without interconnection, immoderate emissions, and miscellaneous gushing. Adrift in this voluble ocean, these writers are not outliers. We began in the middle. Now that we've been floating around for a bit, let's use the rest of this talk to remediate immediacy, to vault out of the middle and take some distance on this dominant style for present cultural production by plotting its divergence from past history and by describing some social, economic, and technological causes of its meteoric ascent. Knausgaard's nausea is felt by a global cohort producing what is contentiously termed auto-fiction. That's our global cohort. I apologize. Having trouble getting these to run the right direction. Okay, so auto-fiction. Autos is a Greek reflexive pronoun. Self, same, of itself, independent, natural, not made. In English compounds, it usually means self-generated, self-acting, spontaneous, as in automatic. Autofictions, then, fictions which are not made, not fictions, forego character, offering a protagonist who's the same as the author in name and circumstance and real friends and real family. They forego plot usually, offering first-person present tense short span impressions of not much happening. And they forego fictional narrativity's capacity to mediate other worlds or the lives of others. All these deflations deliver identity, instantaneity, iteration, as against fictional construction, duration, and mediation. It's a break with form that unleashes realness and presence, and that's been connoted since the term was first used in English in 1976 and in French in 1977. And it continues to be proclaimed by figures like Rachel Cusk, who shares Knausgaard's visceral sense of a crisis of narrative's distance from reality, avowing that fiction is, quote, fake and embarrassing. The idea of making up John and Jane and having them do things seems utterly ridiculous. And she offers instead her much lauded outline trilogy as intensely real. Sheila Heti similarly declares, I'm less interested in writing about fictional people because it seems so tiresome to make up a fake person and put them through the paces of a fake story. I can't do it. And her resultant How Should a Person Be? New York Times bestseller, a scrapbook of transcribed conversations, real emails, and essayettes, hosts in its polyform what she calls the unfurling of the soul on the page. These pursuits of immediacy against fictionality and by way of personality hyperextend a trend that has been underway in the 21st century as a profound formal anomaly in the history of the novel, a new dominance of the first person. For most of its 300-year existence, third person has been the norm for the Anglophone novel. Very early British novelists like Defoe and Richardson often used first-person narration, though they did so with editorial prefaces and frame narratives, and with a formal importance of Bildung or long temporal arcs that differentiated the narrating self from the character self. All aspects that kind of cast a lot of static in the way of writing as immediatist self-effusion. After this initial period of the early English novel, there is a sudden and profound change. The computational analytics expert and romanticist, Ted Underwood, has calculated that change. He notes that he finds that the prevalence of the third person begins to skyrocket even as the total number of novels published in English expands astronomically. So in the early 18th century, there is a sudden increase from those early texts into third-person texts. And then this proportion of third-person prevalence holds extremely steady across the 19th century. The third person proves definitional for the novel form, that is. And how great that is. There's an extraordinary production of a mode of thought that's unavailable to us in everyday life, in our everyday lived experience, and our stupid envelopes. Third person stretches towards speculative objectivity and away from embodied subjectivity. A half-awake critic wandering bookstore aisles and contemplating prize winners may have noticed that this is simply not the case anymore. What our colleague Chris Mazza has tracked in creative writing workshops and literary magazine submissions, she calls it a too much of moi, is a profound alteration in literary history. Quantitative proof isn't the point of this argument, but for kicks, I asked Ted to run his code on an expanded data set that includes the 20th century and extends into the 21st century, and he found what I expected. The consistent dominance of the third person holds across the 20th century too. So this is the falling rate of first person, basically, is what the chart shows. Until its last quarter, there's a 250-year trend. The prevalence of first person then, at the end of that 250-year period, starts to increase markedly around 1970. And in the first decade of the 21st century, the rate of increase is precipitous. First personalism in the novel is an overarching mutation, a gutting of literary objectivity, of which autofiction, with its heady rejection of fictional mediation and suspicion of speaking for others, with its enshrining of embodied charismatic personalism as intensely real, could be understood as the theory. It is then a matter of conceptual consequence and tectonic historical change and genre vitiation, and not just of attitudinal attunement, that autofiction's position of explicit immediacy so boomingly conglomerates itself with official critical theory, which is busy codifying its own rejection of mediation in projects like critical realism, post-critique, and proliferating nihilisms. The passage we opened with from Harcourt declares its immediatism as a deliberate departure from the trajectory of critical theory from Hegel, Marx, and Adorno. To quickly gloss this about face, we can say that definitionally, like the novel's constitutive third-person speculative consciousness, theory is an objectivation of philosophy, It critically interrogates the place from which philosophy is seeing. It tries to expand the philosopher's gaze from being and the world to the meta level of reflection upon the problem of how to know being and the world. Hegel affects this revolution from philosophy to theory by naming immediacy as the original philosophical error. Theory was thus born as the critique of immediacy, the challenging of the apparent givenness of phenomena by registering what Hegel posed as the complex process of mediation. Then Marx comes along and he famously pushes Hegel. This critique of immediacy requires inquiring into the very fabric of relations that make theory possible, the social structure of class rule that inequitably allots food and shelter and time for speculation. In another permutation, Adorno and Horkheimer ramified the exploration of social mediation. It's not enough for critique to register that there is no immediately perceiving subject independent of its social constitution. Critique must also explore how there is neither any simply given object, how reality and phenomena and bodies are produced through means like war, bureaucracy, mass media, and ideology. Identifying all of these as outmoded, Harcourt presents being towards praxis as a consummation of 20th century feminism, history of science, and analytic philosophy, which reconfigure theoretical knowledge away from mediation by impugning objectivity and generalization and embracing the democratic ethics of everyone speaking for themselves. Harcourt quotes Bruno Latour, the prophet of assemblage and entanglement, as immediacy topoi, and enjoins us to praxis not as the construction of collective agency, but as auto-itemization. This is Harcourt quoting Latour in a summative way. There, I've finished. Now it's your turn to present yourself. While autofiction delegitimates fictional mediations of both other people and made-up people, subjectivities that would be waiting to be made, or collective consciousnesses reaching for form, Harcourt's reinvention of praxis as self-presentation attests to a parallel movement in theory, which indeed calls itself auto-theory. Merging memoir with theory, auto-theory, as the coiner of the term Paul Preciado declares, is, quote, a theory of self, blending, quote, a diaristic account of daily life with a penetrating analysis of gender and other hot paradigms. Auto-theory is theory incorporated, a happy effect of its institutionalization and popularization. Its standard bearers have even become New York Times bestsellers and National Book Critics Circle Award winners, like Maggie Nelson's 2015 The Argonauts, whose jacket copy anoints it a genre-bending memoir, a work of auto-theory. Many other 21st century works by academic theorists wear this mantle. Not just literary personalities like Eve Sedgwick or Lauren Berlant, but also anthropologists Kathleen Stewart and Mick Taussig, art historians T.J. Clark and W.G.T. Mitchell, Black studies experts Frank Wilderson, Saida Hartman, Christina Sharp, sociologist Didier Eribon, gender theorist Sarah Ahmed. Often from crossover publishing houses, these works offer lush illuminations in the form of aphorisms and fragments and highly suggestive gambits that expressly thwart systematic elucidation in a dance of evanescence and plenum. Immediatist auto-theory does not make arguments, usually, that its readers use to scaffold other arguments. It similarly does not countenance counter-argument for what theorist can dispute another's experience. What are we enjoying to do when reading auto-theory, after all, but pen our own, and with luck get a big publisher's advance. Now it is your turn. This ecstasy for auto theory across rank within the university and across constituencies extramurally cannot be overstated. Auto theory enkindles senior academics bored of theory's many funerals, and even more so, it ignites younger academics searching for openings in an economic and professional landscape of forbidding foreclosure. Gigification of academic labor crams academic production. Manifest your individual take in your individual style with this short-term teaching gig here, this Substack subscriber there. In this way, I think we can see auto theory as a partial response to a context in which theorists with fair labor conditions, like tenure, encounter their severe lack of peer audience, and theorists without fair labor conditions hustle for crossover appeal to eke out a living. Precaritized labor in the university and its corollary in the publishing industry importantly contextualize auto writing quite differently than the older tradition of 70s life writing. And these conditions have to be centered, as Lee Constantino is starting to do, against the kind of tiresome academic arguments that nothing is never new under the sun, that autofiction is as old as the 70s or as old as the novel itself. Here, for instance, is such work of contextualization. It's Maggie Nelson connecting the novelty of her genre to university labor. I'm always looking for terms that are not memoir. And since this book has more theory in it than other books of mine, auto theory seemed an apt description. I can teach most anything in the humanities I want. Further, our MFA program was specifically founded on its lack of partition between critical and creative writing. While writing this book, I taught a course called Wild Theory for my grad students, focused on theoretical writing that falls out of boundaries or disciplines or even sense-making. That was a lot of fun. For Nelson, auto theory is the fun, free wilding in lack of partition, what she also calls in the Agronauts flow, plethora, kaleidoscopic shifting, and excess. So many virtues of immediacy that she overtly links to her flexible labor. I can teach most anything in the humanities I want is at once a product of her position as a tenured full professor at a wealthy school and an inverted image of the generalism demanded of most contingent humanists who indeed fall out of the boundaries of disciplines and cobble together employment, teaching, and writing programs, which have grown exponentially in recent decades, including creative writing, including professional writing, including technical writing, including as majors in fields of advanced research, all while English majors have declined. This efflorescence of writing without reading and Nelson's bounding omnivorism bespeak immediacy as genre melting pot. There's that oceanic feeling again, a washing, waving current in which Nelson's thoughtful proclamation of the Argonauts as auto theory has not gainsaid its status as the foremost example in every academic article and every seminar syllabus of autofiction. In the blur of immediacy, auto theory and autofiction function as two names for the same thing, wilding against genre, against theory, against fiction, against mediation, out of the boundaries of disciplines. Immediatist auto writing blows up form, but it keeps its shit together with charismatic personalism, which arguably comprises literary enterprise as such in the present. The New York Times now calls memoir the dominant genre of contemporary literature, and it has receipts. In the first decade of the new millennium, memoirs often accounted for as much as 80% of the New York Times bestseller list, and 21st century memoir sales have increased a full 400% over those in the 20th century. This generic hegemony is overtly thematized in the best-selling memoir of all time, Michelle Obama's 2018 Becoming, whose 14 million copies to date promise that anyone can capitalize on their own life. Your story is what you have, what you will always have. It is something to own. This truth of self-ownership resounds beyond the genre of memoir. As the historian Ben Yagoda argues, memoir has become the central form of the culture. Not only the way stories are told, but the ways arguments are put forth, products and propensities marketed, ideas floated, acts justified, reputations constructed or salvaged. We could add, of course, the way that academic labor is performed. Such centrality is undeniable in the case of so-called social media, networks of the 2010s that have rerouted the internet's original anonymity into self-expression. Cultivating our personal brands, social media makes memoirists of us all on the daily. Natalie Beach enthuses the compressed, instantaneous memoir modality of the social post. She talks about it bursting open the form of nonfiction. Instagram is memoir in real time. It's memoir without the act of remembering. It's collapsing the distance between writer and reader and critic, which is why it's true feminist storytelling. Beach's little turn here of immediacy theory, form busting, real time, distance collapsing, comes in a personal essay. That genre of writing, which of course has a very long history and a specifically mass media history in the 20th century, but that nonetheless has developed differently in the 21st century, thanks to the convergence of social media apps and publishing industry downsizing. The post-2008 boom in personal essays, Gia Tolentino notes, is, quote, a response to an online climate where content was needed at the exact moment when budgets were slashed. Streaming content, free-flowing from freelancers. Auto-writing without the distance between reader, writer, and critic. Writerly immediacy aestheticizes industrial conditions in publishing, which, as Sarah Briette points out, track closely with gigification and precaritization in other industries. Absent institutions like writers' guilds and staff unions, absent salaries for hours on background, absent knowledge protocols like investigative reporting or long-form synthesis, and drowning in student loan debt. Content creators wield their only asset, expression of their inner life. Your story is something to own. Self-ownership is indeed big business, of which auto-writing is merely a subsidiary. Since the 1970s, privatization of formerly state-funded institutions and supports like education have been justified with the doctrine of human capital. There's no need for anything public if everything is originatedly private, including the private individual privately possessing their own innate human resources. In processes that David Harvey and Sylvia Federici and Ashley Dawson and others label the new enclosures, the defunding of social welfare and slashing of corporate and affluent taxes offloads society's burden to undertake the nurturing and growth of its own future workforce onto individuals themselves, who become self-providers and self-investors through what political theorist Wendy Brown calls responsibilization. What more shall I do? Absent mediation, the best human capital rises to the top. Toddlers of YouTube self-monetizing, mompreneurs pumping brands, hillbilly elegying all the way to the highest office in the land. We are all resilient sole proprietors bootstrapping across dystopia. Immediacy in autofiction and auto theory thus stylizes the dismantled social mediations of human capital emanation in late capitalism. Late capitalism has been a Marxist term for more than a century. It was used to describe everything from post-Great War market integration to post-war prosperity, to 70s stagflation, and now millennial leverage busts. And of course, the cultural logic most famously associated with that phase is postmodernism in Jameson's magisterial work. If critics more and more agree that postmodernism is no longer the logic of the present, and if immediacy might convincingly name a qualitatively different formation, then what's the differentiation within late capitalism to which immediacy corresponds? Historians and political economists generally pinpoint 1973 as a conjuncture when overlapping crises, oil, inflation, and recession, ended the post-war boom and altered the place of the US in the global order, resulting in what even Larry Summers and other official minds now recognize as the multi-decade era of stagnation that we find ourselves in. To manage these crises and reignite US profit-making, companies and governments tried to streamline production of goods and services, attacking unions, pursuing automation and outsourcing, and ratcheting up demand for productivity, including responsibilization. In parallel with these production strategies, there arose also unprecedented concentration on circulation, not just on making things as cheaply as possible, in other words, but on exchanging things as smoothly as possible to compensate for the limits to extracting profit from production. The late 1990s are pivotal for this squeeze. The technological revolution of digital platforms and microelectronics promised to utterly transform processes of circulation to be more emanative and instantaneous, more immediate. Circulation innovations compress the time lags and geographic expanses and misfires of exchange, just-in-time logistics, high-frequency trading, the 24/7 working day, and the outsized growth of network platforms on which all these depend are all infrastructures of immediacy. The virtualization of the exchange sphere enables the circulation of goods that circumvents the brick-and-mortar costs of retail, facilitates the coordination of information that circumvents the human resources ground costs of journalism and communications, and underwrites the gig economy, which circumvents the whole apparatus of the abode of production. It also transforms exchange itself into commodity, since automated and computerized interactions can be discretized into data that in turn commands a high price among firms and licenses ever more expansion of surveillance and securitization. Digitization is thus the crucial determinant of immediacy as style. The symbolic operations that structure our economic conditions, namely computer code, have sold themselves as disappearing mediators, as more and more rapid, more and more frictionless, leaving us in an imaginary hall of mirrors. Whereas early commercial and consumer computing in the 70s and 80s was not this way, users directly encountered and executed code and code functions. The personal computer presumed individuals as programmers, but as Ian Bogost has argued, after the rise of the graphic user interface, we no longer interact with computational media at the level of the symbolic. Instead, we click folders on tidy desktops. This shift prompts Wendy Chen to directly analogize software to Althusser's famous definition of ideology, the imaginary relation of individuals to their real conditions of existence. And fittingly, Kate Hales pinpoints it as a necessary transformation of cultural production, referring to the introduction of the first interface-forward internet browser, Netscape. Kate Hales writes, "On or about August 1995, postmodernism died." After the digital revolution, then, we remain in the same historical phase of the accumulation crisis that defines postmodernism as aesthetic style, but we take up a different relation to the very media of which that style might be composed, an obfuscation of medium. The evolution of personal computing, the iPhone, the eye-sweeting of everything, flood users in an imaginary realm of icons and finger swipes rather than a symbolic realm of functions and code. Software is the medium that is not a medium, Alexander Galloway diagnoses. Oddly, I think, many contemporary media theorists essentialize this obfuscating of medium into the very vocation or desire of media itself across its history. From Plato's cave to virtual reality, so the story goes, we find an ever more technologically enhanced, perennial pursuit of increased immediacy. Marxist historiography of production crises and the intensification of the circuit of value realization suggest something else. Immediatism discloses not an inner disposition of media, but an outer configuration of the political world in which these media are produced. The question of whether the promise of immediatized circulation has delivered, whether circulation techniques can solve capitalist contradictions, must contend with the dot-com bust in the early 2000s and the great financial meltdown and the K-shaped recovery, to say nothing of immiseration and ecocide. Those are reckonings for another day. But today we can only conclude too quickly that even though earnest practitioners like Harcourt and Knausgaard proffer the anti-mediation, anti-fiction, anti-theory, effulgent expressivism of flexible auto-writing as an organically intellectual innovation, capitalism's crisis management strategy of immediatizing circulation conditions immediacy as cultural style. Insofar as immediacy in both commercial pop and the conceptual avant-garde merely indexes this management strategy, it amounts in the end to integrated spectacle. Of course, our ideas and our art, our books and our TV might critique the illusions they also propound. That's the promise of dialectical interpretation. This possibility of imminently critical culture is all but snuffed out in auto-writing, whose genre merging, emanativeness, concretudes, and explicit anti-dialecticism eliminate cuts, contradictions, and conceptuality that would be necessary for critique, and whose refusals of collectivity or generality obviate utopian energy. Immediacy as determined style renders our modes of imagining and theorizing too close to our mode of production, or its ideology anyway. There is so very much that is desirable about everyone speaking their truth in turn, about intensity and affirmation. And there's so very much transgressive poetic glam in the blur of memoir fiction theory. Yet this fluent hyperproximity and immersive propagation discredit and incapacitate the very mediations that could more adequately redress omnicrisis, including the catastrophe of how to make human extinction less grotesquely violent. The universal, though uneven, distribution of the coming ecological horrors, the already present ecological horrors, points to the unimmediate quality of the common. Commons are not given, they are produced, Federici reminds us. What kinds of mediations engage in this production of a commons, this intercessive relating that immediacy spurns? How about fictional, theoretical, and speculative forms of imagining, like in the rare, residual, third-person novels that insist on the primacy of objectivated impersonality, such as those of Brandon Taylor, Colson Whitehead, and Diana Evans? or in rare, co-authored, bold declarations of collective interest, like Cynthia Arruzia, Titi Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser's Feminism for the 99%, or in rare social realist ensemble TV, like Succession or Queen Sugar. Such mediations performatively construct for us what is not immediately given: impersonal points of view, disembodied knowledge, collective synthesis, social building, even by speaking for others, even by fighting for those who don't know. In Immediacy lately, everything is an emergency burning for expression. But sort of like Audre Lorde said, mediation is not a luxury. Thank you.
I hope that we can overcome the mediation of Zoom to thank Anna Kornbluh collectively for such a great talk. We're going to open up our virtual floor to questions. And for those late to the party, I would just like to remind you that you can post either a question or an intent to ask a question in chat. And Jared, as the first to raise your hand, why don't you go ahead?
Wow, that never happens. Hi, thank you, Anna. That was so awesome. It's so nice to see your face. I feel like it's been a long, long time. I'm working on this, like the 70s auto theory kind of stuff right now, and in more of the poetic realm. And I'm curious, just like your thoughts, or if you can like speak more to like, what do we do with like objects like auto theory, like even in the novel, like I'm looking at teaching Zami this week, and that's doing a ton of this kind of work. But what do we do with like auto theory that is intently concerned with challenging like formal operations? So auto theory that's like really looking in on itself to challenge bigger concepts about form. Because for me, like in doing so, you can make form capacious enough to start to question those larger ideologies that you were kind of laying out there. But again, thank you. That was so awesome to hear this synthesize, and it's thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I was moving through it somewhat quickly, but I do think one of the forces of what I'm trying to do is actually, differentiate 70s origins of these genres from the present. And that is because, again, of this metabolized character of theory and this institutionalized character of it. And so where the directionality is, like, I think that in something like Zami, as you say, there is a questing for forms of representation that can be adequate to different kinds of subjectivities and that are, located within often explicitly political movements, right? And I think that it's like the directionality has changed now, and the kind of immanentism and immediacy and the way that the genres function is as kind of non-relation ultimately, right? This iterative, now it is your turn. Right. So, and I also think that the question of formal inventiveness has somehow, been kind of eviscerated into a notion that formlessness is what's liberatory, and that endless indistinction and blurring and hybridity is the kind of realm of freedom somehow. So that's not about finding specific forms, it's about annihilating any kinds of genre distinctions actually. And there are some things that one loses with that, like third person anti-phenomenal consciousness.
Thank you.
We have a question from Pete Coviello now.
Oh, okay. I'll, in case I fumble it, I've been writing it to myself, so I'll put it in the chat, but then I'll just read it. Anna, thank you for enlivening an otherwise like snowy and shitty Thursday afternoon. So here's my question, which is, what would you say to someone who looks at the premise of first person equals like a refusal of mediation or an intense attachment to immediacy, and it's basically like, listen, Knausgaard's quite impressively dumb account of this does not actually speak for much. the astonishing breadth of people you cite doing only auto theory don't really seem to me to agree on the need or even the desirability for immediacy in any form. Dissemble it through the many other forms that go into writing even first-person works, and comport themselves in a multiplicity of ways to questions of collectivity and sociality in ways not really at all coordinate or reducible to hardcore or Latour, less still. So like Lauren Berlant and Fred Moten's books are not much like Michelle Obama's. And like, I think we probably agree, the first person is one of the least bad things about Maggie Nelson's book. But like, so I wonder what you would say of someone who's thinks that pretending that these books are equivalent might obscure more than it clarifies, and who worry about something like or anti-dialectical about imagining there's not from the first interwovenness of I and we. So that those distinctions are, so that would be how I would that would be how I'd phrase the question. And again, thank you for making this Thursday better than it would otherwise have been.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think, there's sort of like a genre problem of like, what is this argument, right? If one is trying to name a style, it's obviously an agglomerative, kind of category, right? And so we're going to be able to come up with individual exceptions to it. We might even be able to come up with what we can think of as meaningful movements or collectivities or energies that would have some recognizable generic determinants other than auto theory, that we would say like, oh no, but there's this group over here that does auto theory in this way. I think so. There's sort of the just genre problem of like, what's the argument I'm trying to make, and then how do we put that argument to work in the analysis of particular cultural texts, right? But then I think the kind of and I'm willing to hazard that as a tension, when one tries to do theory and when one tries to make categories, and it might even be a tension, especially about thinking about the contemporary, which you have to think with the help of genre, which is why one likes long arcs about those. But then if you want to take the, really specific argument about, are there more and less ideological ways of doing the first person? Are there more and less, political configurations of what a voice is doing when it is presenting itself? Then I think we could try to have out that argument. But again, it seems to me that there is this uniformity around the pursuit of a repudiation of mediation, which is very worrisome and which seems to, kind of incapacitate the kinds of knowledge or representation that would require that we actually set our own voices aside sometimes. So, I think that it's one could say, here's a specific example that is an objection to the theory. But I think that I would like to fight out what happens in, instances of radical, beloved auto theory, because I'm not sure that what those texts enjoin us to do is anything other than write our own.
We have a question from Dan Stout and then one from Blake. So we'll go in that order. Dan?
Hey, Anna. Thank you for that. Haven't been in a room like this in a while. I guess my question was sort of a version of Peter's, but maybe without like the hostility to Nelson, which was like, first, I guess, like, is the first person really like a good way to track this? Like, I was thinking about like Ben Lerner and Zadie Smith and like Tom McCarthy, all of whom are writing first person or virtually first person novels, but none of whom like seem to be, to me anyway, doing like the thing you're doing. So I guess that would be the novel side of the kind of, is it as monolithic as you're presenting it? And it's not clear to me that Smith is really as committed to immediacy as is being presented, in the case that you're pushing here. So I guess the first question was like, is it more variable? If and if it is, then like, can't we do what we just always did, which was like discard the objects that we didn't care about, like not teach Michelle Obama's memoir, but continue to teach the thing that we want to do? And like, so like, what's the problem? Is it just that we're losing market share? Is it that we're losing majors? But in terms of like the basic operations of criticism, is anything really that different? And isn't reading always like an act of putting your own voice aside, at least a little bit? And so can't we just keep reading, I guess? So like a less alarmist view of what I agree is not an awesome situation.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so there's a little bit of the difficulty that I'm trying to describe like an expanded field of writing that I have mushed a bunch of sort of more refined analyses of into like a talk version, right? So why is first person a problem, and is first person, in the novel actually the face of immediacy in, auto theory or conceptuality, or immediacy as our cultural style? I think one might find first person fictions that they thought were anti-immediatist, or that had interesting figurative systems, or also, of course, there remain polyfocal first person fictions, right, that don't have a third person narration, but like I just read Memorial by Brian Washington as a sort of a split back and forth, two different first persons. So it may be that the problem of immediacy doesn't 100% map on to the first person, but it is the case that we are living through an incredible mutation in the history of the Anglophone novel, and it's not recognizable as a mutation if you don't think about the long, sweep of history. And I think it is actually an alarming mutation, because the refusal of third person, the discrediting of third person, the delegitimating of it as a mode means that we're losing out on the speculative and theoretical and non-personal, modes of thought that the novel offers us. And I think that's a real loss. So I do want to try to mark that loss as having some relation to a bigger set of logics about intensity of one-on-one encounters and their sort of iterative recitation. So could we discard the objects? It's hard to teach third person fiction when there aren't any being written. And that's not, just like a market share problem. It is about what students who want themselves to write think are available and allowable paths that are open to them for literary production. And it's not just like an issue of critical judgment, like let's pick good things to teach or to read or to study. It's because there's a pervasiveness of the kind of canceling of the dimension of abstraction or figuration that I think it's really worrisome.
Blake, do you want to go ahead and ask your question, or should I read it?
Either way is fine. Do you want to
go ahead, Blake? You can do it.
Oh, okay. No, thank you, Anna. Terrific talk, and I think the critique is spot on, and very pointed and incisive. My question is really just it's a more historical, genealogical periodizing kind of question. And so, can you talk about that which you started in the middle, and then you kind of went to the present, and you went back to the 18th century, and so I'm wondering about between the turn to the 19th century and in the middle, and particularly thinking about the role that existentialism and particularly Heideggerianism has played as kind of a root theoretical framework for lots of Euro-American theoretical thinking and so on. And then extending that further back, thinking back to the sort of origins of existentialism and in the Romantic period, and whether the model of immediacy operative in those periods is the same or akin or linked to the model of immediacy that you're thinking through critically.
I mean, right. So thank you for that. There's definitely long philosophical, traditions, and one didn't tell the story because I was trying to mix sort of theory and literature of, how do we get from mediation is everything and the critique of immediacy is everything in 19th century German philosophy, say, or in the birth of critique to the refusal of mediation in a very earnest and, extremely well-reasoned way. So how do you tell that story? I think that you're right, that existentialism and various kinds of phenomenological traditions are absolutely central there. I think that the feminist critique of philosophy is absolutely central there, and I have a kind of essay tracking that in more granular genealogical terms coming out soon. So there is a long movement of phenomenological, possibly existential, concern about objectivity, concern about collectivity, concern about abstraction. And there are a lot of sources for that. And so not all of those are readily periodizable by, the digital revolution. Say that's absolutely true. I guess the question would be like, what is our, what's the quantitative kind of, substantialization of those tendencies, or the stamping out of the possibility of other kinds of philosophy in the present, if you want to make the periodizing term that way. So I think you were sort of also asking about a literary version of it in terms of romanticism. And, it would seem to me like there's the problem in the poetic presentation of the lyrical subject of what is it that is trying to be produced in terms of relationship. But certainly in English Romanticism, what is trying to be produced is historical consciousness. What is trying to be produced is, the differentiation, ironically, tragically, and so on, of the poetic self from the kind of self that is being conjured. Or even, think about the incredible kind of tradition of the dramatic monologue in Browning, and like the speaking in the first person that is linguistically undermined as like not an immanent self-authorizing subject, right? So I think you could do a kind of account of literary and poetic versions of first person that were not interested in the same kind of compression and the same kind of reality hunger as we see in the present.
Thank you.
Anna, I'm going to try to slip a question in here too, and I'll try to make it really short so that we can move on with some others. But thank you for this fantastic talk once again. I was really struck by your inclusion of people like Sedgwick and Sarah Ahmed in your list of the first person folks, because I think of like the last chapter of Touching Feeling, or Sarah Ahmed's, whole account of the feminist killjoy as, this idea of building collectives in which you may have a first person element, but there's a kind of instrumentality of that the whole purpose of it is that you recognize your condition in relation to other people. And that's why Ahmed is so interested in doing things like assigning a reading list, so that, the interest in a reading list is in, getting a kind of awareness of your position in relation to someone else's, and you realize a kind of sameness in that condition, and it got me to start thinking, well, is the real problem, and I guess this is partly related to Dan's question, like, is the real problem immediacy, or are you also pointing to bad kinds of mediation? Because I'm not sure, like, so you can point to a ton of people who are not interested in immediacy? You know, I think it would be wrong actually to say that Ahmed is, but is it just like, is it worth pointing to, yes, there's an account of mediation here. And one can say that with political theory too. You know, it's like there's no greater prophet of mediation in like 20th century political theory, I think, than John Rawls. You know, he's like way up there. He's way into mediation. And so is Edmund Burke. You know, it's like the politic well-wrought veil.
Yeah.
But like, would it be worth saying, like, adding this layer here and saying that there are certain kinds of mediation that you're not interested in?
Yeah, no, that's a well-posed question. I mean, I think, so to me, the issue is like, if now I finish and it's your turn to present yourself, or if I am writing this book and I'm going to tell you that I'm soliciting you into my lifestyle, right, into living a feminist life, as Ahmed does, and so on. But my form of solicitation, or my form of entreaty or of relation, is one of kind of flat affirmation or mirroring. It seems to me to be overdetermined by like this discretized situation in which we can only sort of like say yes to things, and it's not clear what comes from that other than more self-stylization. So I want there to be a project of building representations and of building synthetic values and commonly held commitments that might actually be about people not affirming things or not finding themselves mirrored in things. So yeah, I think that there are probably things that are tendered as gestures of mediation that feel to me to generically, solipsistically, so on, function as mere occasions for affirmation. And I do mean what I say about we're not meant to argue with one another in response to these recitations.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to move on to a question that Zachary Tavlin posed, and I'm going to read it for you on request. Is about criticism. Why is the angle from the critic holding the ideologies you associate with immediacy up to the first person narrative rather than disregarding or ignoring that ideology and digging into the way every attempt at immediacy on the part of an artist in fact reveals mediation? In other words, we look into the techniques at creating immediacy effects. I'm reading that question very well. So if you'd like me to read it again, I can.
So that the critic's job isn't to take at face value what is claimed as the immediacy effects. The critic's job is to understand how those are produced. Of course, immediacy as style means that it is a formed thing. It is a made thing, right? First person is one of the kind of architectures of it, but it's not. It might not be the only one. But when we reveal those effects, like, what are we trying to arrive at then critically, right? A sense that language is being used for the purpose of anti-figurative, emanation and of solicitation of, a kind of flatness of response, I think. A kind of affirmation that then one is activated into their own presentation by. So it's true that one could, sort of say like, oh, well, what about how Knausgaard has these lengthy philosophical disquisitions? Or what about Knausgaard's use of the detail? And don't these, sort of add up to the text revealing itself as mediated? Yeah, it's written. He wrote 3,600 pages, but I think that at a certain point, the critical task isn't to show this is fake or this is constructed. It's to think about what kind of work this is doing in relation to other, genres or other, kind of dissolving genres, and other kind of logics of social or anti-social organization.
Thank you. We have a question from Corbin.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for this great talk as the darkness descends on us. So I have a question about periodization, sort of along the lines of, I think, what Blake was getting at, but slightly from a different angle. So you gave us sort of at the beginning of the talk, the sort of trajectory from Hegel to Marx to Adorno. And then we sort of also received like a series of dates and moments, right? So 2008, the dot-com bubble, the 70s. And so I'm sort of thinking through these sort of phases or periods in the hope of like trying to get you to say a little bit more about the like peculiarity or particularity of the present. And so why I say that is like, part of me thinks, in some ways, are we not just sort of stuck in the moment of the culture industry from Adorno and Horkheimer, right? Like, so for them, in that essay, in that chapter, like the dominant style is the negation of style, right? Which seems very like opposite to what you're saying. And that's related to what they call the false unity of the particular and the universal, right? So maybe slightly different than if I'm sort of, understanding your talk, maybe the sort of overtaking of the universal by the particular. For them, it's this sort of, again, this like immediacy that sort of happens in the welding of those two concepts together in a very undialectical way, right? So I guess like, and then we get Jameson and the cultural logic of postmodernism. So like, what is the cultural logic of immediacy? Is it digitization, which you sort of gesture at? But like, so to me that we seem to still be like in the realm of symptoms or appearances when we're thinking about like very helpfully like adjunctification, digitization, all of these things that you helpfully draw our attention to, sort of bolstered by the help of Ted Underwood, and that we can sort of trace these things, right? But what is the sort of infrastructural underpinning of this? If we're to sort of have a particular cultural logic of the present that is immediacy.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, so, I'm sort of trying on the hypothesis that that there is something different about the 21st century from the 20th century. And that even if we take, 1970s and kind of the crisis and the accumulation of profit or the production of profit, the profitability of first world economies and so on, as a kind of decisive cultural determinant that we can still kind of granulate within there. There's a hazard that that's not quite right. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to think about, in long view. There are very strange things going on in the realm of representation in long view right now. To me, it is strange that theorists are only writing memoirs. It is strange that you can't find a third person novel at the bookstore. Or almost not at all in terms of what's being published, and that might be obviously published industry, etc. But so how do we explain those strangenesses? I am trying on the notion that there is something that happens in our infrastructures of economic production with the digital revolution, and that could be historically wrong, but it could also be, vulgar in the sense that it's in a strict vulgar Marxist sense, that it's an explanation of a series of aesthetic phenomena that I find extremely worrisome in terms of their, just arrogation of the faculty of art and of the capacity of abstraction. But I do think that there needs to be some explanation for them. So I think, I don't know if you were just asking me to repeat the answer that it's digitization, and one has to think about what that really means in terms of whether that is, any kind of actual transformation in the base of economic relations, or merely like a kind of, change in how the economic relations present their own face, the interface effect as the interface of crises of accumulation. That's why I think this question of, whether any of this gets whether any of this is effective now, you can't tell until there's some other aesthetic style or political order, right? So what part of what I want from you guys is so hard to make ideas in social isolation, right? But is like, what do you think of that vulgar gesture? If stuff is happening in a different way, aesthetic at the level of aesthetic production and cultural production, knowledge production, that is intensely blurred together and intensely immanentist, then how do we explain that?
Thanks.
Walter Michaels, you're up next.
Hey, thank you. So Anna, I have a sort of friendly amendment to propose. It's friendly because, what I see is if you use the term neoliberal aesthetics the way it was originally intended as entirely pejorative, I think that the pejorative sense of it in many respects corresponds or at least overlaps with all the things that you're diagnosing under the sort of rubrics of the first person and immediacy. So that's the friendly part. And actually, I'm also kind of really sympathetic to, the idea that the move to the first person on this grand scale makes a difference. So I want to sort of defend that part too. A third part I'm sympathetic to, which is that I think absolutely, well, we'll come down to individual cases. I don't think you can do individual cases just by saying, to go back to Pete's thing, Lauren Berlant doesn't mean the same thing that Michelle Obama does. My own sense that would be they actually probably do mean exactly the same thing, although it would take a while to show how it worked in that way. But that is a case by case. You've got to do the reading to do that. Obviously, that was not the point today. So where the amendment comes in is this, though. If you stick with the first person, is that it seems to me that one of the ways to think about this shift to the first person is that even if one were to accept your basic idea of what it does, as it were, in itself, another way to understand it, or another way to understand within it, is that it's precisely in the first person narrative that becomes the site in which one could, that is, certain artists could, certain writers could, certain, if we transpose it into other art forms, certain photographers could, because photography would be very, very close to a certain set of arguments like this. It's precisely that becomes the opportunity to actually produce what you're describing as a dialectical relation to this. So that, in fact, it's interesting that there are people writing in the third person, and one wants to look at those texts too. But if you were looking in a way for the most powerful texts to, in effect, produce a kind of resistance to what it is you're describing, it would actually make complete sense to find them in the first person. It would be, in effect, the way through, the way out is through. So I think that there's a way in which, again, the amendment part would be to say, you don't really have to hang anything at all on the idea that the first person narration is such that does that, although you can completely hang on to the idea that, once you enter the sort of world of first person narration, you've entered a world in which the issues are as you describe them, but the outcome is not, as it were, necessarily as you describe it. So, the obvious example would be someone who already quoted before, which would be McCarthy, but the point would not be to read like Remainder. The interesting point that it's actually his only good novel, that the rest of them suck in various different ways, and that and you have to think about why that's true. But part of the point would be, in thinking about that, would be to say, it's not the case we have to go back and just do reading and read things as we do. Actually, no, you have to read it as, in your terms, a first-person novel, but you have to read it as a first-person novel against what the first-person novel now means. And the only way to be, as it were, against that first person is at the same time be within it. So I take it back, not the only way, but a powerful or potentially powerful way. So you don't, you want to hang on to the strength of that graph, but you also want to sort of think that graph is not quite dispositive in the way that you presented it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I am doing my own version of like hyper compressed argumentation here, both because I wanted to sort of make the link between the literature world and the theory world in one talk, because I am thinking about the blur between them as a crucial kind of aspect of the problem I'm trying to figure out. But it is true that one can read first person against itself. And this goes back to the problem that Pete has of what is one doing when a critic is making kind of synthetic claims about logics in culture, right? It is not true, I don't think, that first person is capable of the kinds of speculation, the kinds of impersonal, disembodied, totally anti-phenomenal, impossible, inaccessible to us in everyday life knowledge that third person fiction can do. So I am kind of interested in that as a hard difference. And so that's, again, the kind of dimension of speculation and abstraction, of impersonality and of collectivity, of general mentation, of free and direct discourse, right, that is being lost in the present. So I'm a little bit ambivalent, I guess, about whether, about how hard I want to say there isn't a good first person way to access this problem, because I'm so interested in its in phenomenalization as this kind of chaining us into this world, this bleak horizon. But I will take your amendment.
I just stated the quick stop is that the one way to think about that would be think about McCarthy's complete obsession with the idea of the normative in that novel, and think about what the normative does to the first person right away.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about that novel. I think it's a fascinating novel. There are ways to be sort of disidentified or dissociated from the first person pronoun, right? Is that the same as the conjugation of a possible collective consciousness that third person or that free-floating unattributed mentation can produce? I don't think so.
Ordinarily, I would be just shutting things down at this moment and asking people to talk things over with some Chardonnay in their hands and some cheese and crackers. But absent those, Anna, would you mind taking a couple more questions?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I would just especially say that I hope that anybody who has afterthoughts will send them to me, because, this is new work and it's messy work. And the whole point of being with other people is that ideas are social. And I really miss that. So I'd love to hear from anybody who doesn't have time. But yeah, if anybody can stay and wants to chat some more.
Okay. Justin, you're up next.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks for all the fascinating questions. I'm having to sort of revise mine on the fly because I don't want to retread too much ground that's already been covered. But I guess I'll sort of ask about, toward the end of your talk, you gestured toward the fact that one of the possible material conditions of this sort of rise of the first person and memoir is the basically the loss of the symbolic to a domain other than discourse, right? It's sort of the domain of code or intelligent machinery or something like that. And I'm sort of wondering, I guess, if that means that effectively this mode of representation just sort of is stuck in the imaginary without access to the other sort of poles of the Lacanian triumvirate. I mean, to sort of put this really vulgarly and stupidly, should the area of critique not be the first person narrative, but in some ways I don't even know how to ask this question. Should we all become code critiquers or something like that? You know what I mean? Why? What's at stake in sort of retaining the emphasis on the literary object, I guess, under these circumstances?
Okay, that's a great question. And I said at the very beginning, if a concept works for you, hopefully you're thinking of lots of things that aren't literary, right? The literary is not the only axis of the like messy book as I've written it. TV is a big one, streaming video, cinema, the use of video cinematography and the iPhone cinematography. I am looking down in the corner at Walter because I'm sort of hedging about a photography chapter, actually. I'm hedging because the only thing I can sort of really want to oppose is like Kardashian selfie book, coffee table books, and like Edward Burtynsky. But I'm going to have to think about it a little bit more. But there are all kinds of other, and, smart people who are here could probably talk about music, which I don't think I'm going to end up doing. So there's a residual problem of the literary, but there's it's one of my objects I'm trained in thinking of, and the one I the most get paid to think about. And I do think that the just kind of expanded field of genre melt and of presentational hyper-production of writing, which the digital is the substrate of, but the collapse of the publishing industry and the collapse of academia are also the cause of, is like a very fascinating object problem. So what does the literary gives us also the kind of staging in a different way of this tension between the symbolic and the imaginary than images do, right? So I do want to kind of work that out. I mean, the problem is that if a culture is has a waning efficacy of symbolic representation, a waning efficacy of, the realm of mediation, and has a kind of hall of mirrors of imaginary imago. How do you intervene in that, right? Is there actually a kind of symbolization, a practice of mediation that intervenes in that or not? And I don't think that literature is likely to be that one. But the fact remains that there's a stupendous amount of text that people are producing, right? We're in a great kind of, effulgent era of written representation, but it's being generated for the purposes of feeding the algorithm, even if we think it might be meaningful. So your question points me to needing to spell out, is there a special relationship of the literary to immediacy, both in its symptomatization and then in its remediation? And I'm going to have to think that through. I like that question.
We'll take a couple more questions if you can stand it. We've got a lot of them. I don't think we'll have time for all of them. David Pritchard.
Hi. So I tried to write this out because I have a problem with talking, because I like to talk. So I don't know if this is, okay, let's see. I feel like I should go backwards. I guess so I have a couple of questions. One has been has sort of repeatedly bubbled up in some of the stuff that people have said about the kind of what's the, I don't want to play the well, what about this? What about that game? But I think that there's a historical dimension. The cool graph of the declining rate of first person narration or whatever is missing, which is that I think that it would be interesting to compare it with poetry, which was more third person before a certain point in history than it is now, and it's primarily, I would say, first person. Way more first person than prose fiction. And I say this as somebody who doesn't read novels that much. I have a sort of principled stance against the novel as such, about which I will say no more. But I do, I'm interested in that, not just because of my own object choice, as it were, but because I'm curious about how poetry fits into the theory aspect of it, in part because a lot of the theory under discussion from the 70s onward is theory about, a lot of it is French theory, and a lot of the sort of literary objects of a lot of that French theory, not all of it necessarily sort of hardcore high postmodernism, are poetic. And I know that every French theorist who was alive in the 20th century has a thing about Mallarmé or something. But I am kind of curious about how that might require a more precise triangulation, in part because, and this brings me kind of to my second thing, I don't want to like over insist on like generic, because like obviously generic distinctions are important. I don't want to over insist on like the specificity to the point where they cease to be related to one another in some way. But I think that like the sort of like the genealogy or whatever of like immediacy in poetry, as has already come up, is slightly different. But a thing that I would be kind of interested in hearing more about is how like, and so like obviously now we're departing from the realm of Mallarmé, who whatever. But like I think that I'm curious about how like you might speak about like the relationship between these sort of like third person narration as a kind of political mediation and the kind of historical record of, on the one hand, like poetry being like, I don't want to say privileged, but a kind of prominent mode that people who've been like actively involved in revolutionary politics, but just in the 20th century, let's say, kind of turned to, and not in a way where it was immediate, unless you agree with Trotsky about Mayakovsky, which I don't necessarily do. But like, I mean, and actually that's a sort of good test case. That's sort of what I was thinking about, because like Trotsky's critique of Mayakovsky is almost exactly kind of, I mean, not almost exactly, yours is a lot more sophisticated, I think, in the way that it's laid out. But Trotsky's basically like, how could this guy be a revolutionary poet? He doesn't have anything to do with the people. He just makes his eye 150 million people big. It's a Mayakovskomorphism thing or whatever. And so I'm kind of curious about how like the politics thing fits in, especially because, as someone reminded me recently, like another kind of genre that is a kind of thing that revolutionaries produced, and not just in the 20th century. I'm thinking of Stephen Collis's book about Occupy in Vancouver. Like, people write first person I stuff. It's not, it doesn't necessarily seem like auto fiction, but it might be like, I wonder how that might be related, especially because I think that, like, you know, firsthand accounts of like being at an encampment or whatever are important. They do involve a certain kind of immediacy. And then I would want to hear about, I'm interested in hearing about, I'm saying I'm interested in hearing about, so I don't have to like twist this back into a question. I'd be interested in hearing about like how that relates to the sort of the kind of knowledge that is produced in the more mediated third person narratorial form. And then my final question, my final aspect of this multi-part question, full of semicolons perhaps, if it were written out, is how does like, are you kind of, is the sort of normative claim you're making essentially something like the avant-garde but for third person novels instead of poetry? This is, that's just a, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So as far as poetry goes, the operative issue for me in thinking about poetry right now is not first versus third person. It is the use of the poetic line, of the poetic paragraph, and the turn to prose poetry. So it is the kind of actual theorization by that of that by a bunch of poets too, and the publication of memoirs by a bunch of poets. But it's the genre, bleeding, genre melding, indiscrimination, the blur. That's what is interesting to me about contemporary poetics. So I wouldn't diagnose. It's like I wouldn't diagnose the whether the perspective in poetry is third or not, in that as the kind of issue or the crux for immediacy in poetry. I would think about it in terms of the repudiation of line breakage as the kind of formal determinant of poetry. So I mean, that's probably most of what I would say about that. As far as, like, have we learned political things from first person narratives? Of course. Like, one doesn't want to say that the diary of Anne Frank isn't important, or that an Occupy testimonial is not important, or that any, the point would be, what is the intensity of the pressure, of the drive towards immersive representation or anti-representation in the present? It's not that you can't get things from first-person fiction or from memoirs or from political poetry. That's not what I'm trying to figure out, as it were. I mean, I can tell that this is a will be a little bit of a problem for the argument by the, way that there's that recurrent energy in some of the questions. Like, well, but I have these exceptions. It's like, yes, there are these exceptions, but what I'm trying to figure out is sort of, why these capacities of mediation seem to feel urgently to lots of artists and lots of intellectuals like they're illegitimate, bad, wrong, unallowable, unavailable.
Thank you, Anna. I think because we are now getting on a somewhat late hour, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and thank Anna for such a fantastic and generative talk.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing everyone at another event very soon.
Thank you guys so very much.
Thanks for joining us.